The sound of the front door closing signaled Mom's departure, leaving just Dad and me in the house for the weekend. I thought it would be uneventful, just another quiet couple of days. But as the night settled in, so did an eerie stillness. The tension in the air was palpable, yet I told myself it was all in my head. That was until a soft knock on my door shattered the silence. When Dad stepped inside, his gaze held something I couldn't place, something that made my heart race. In that moment, I realized everything was about to change. Life in our house had always been defined by routines. Mom, ever the perfectionist, kept everything in order, from our schedules to the way the house was decorated. Dad was the quieter one, steady and reliable, but always lingering in the background. I'd always thought of him as someone dependable, a calming presence who rarely let emotions show. I was close to both of them in different ways. With Mom, it was the shared energy of day-to-day life. Shopping trips, planning holidays, and endless conversations about school and career plans. With Dad, it was the quiet moments like watching TV together or him offering advice on things I didn't want to ask Mom about. Our relationship was steady, almost predictable, and I found comfort in that. But things had started to shift lately. I noticed the way Dad's attention lingered a bit longer during our conversations, how he asked more questions about my day, about how I was feeling. At first, I thought he was just trying to fill the silence when Mom wasn't around. But then there were the small, almost imperceptible moments that felt different. Like the way he'd brush past me in the kitchen, or how his gaze would linger when I was sitting on the couch. I told myself it was nothing, just overthinking on my part. That weekend, when Mom left to visit her sister, I figured it would be like any other time she was away, quiet, uneventful, and maybe a little boring. Dad and I would share meals, exchange small talk, and go about our separate routines. But from the moment she left, there was something different in the air. The house felt heavier, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That evening, we sat in the living room, the glow of the TV casting faint shadows on the walls. The silence between us wasn't unusual, but it wasn't comfortable either. Dad kept glancing at me, his expression unreadable. I asked if he was okay, and he smiled faintly, saying he was just thinking. But the look in his eyes felt too intense, too personal. And in that moment, I knew this weekend was going to be anything but ordinary. The first night of Mom's absence unfolded like any other. I finished my homework, scrolled through my phone, and wandered into the living room to join Dad, who was watching an old movie. The glow of the TV filled the dim room, and the quiet hum of the dialogue was the only sound between us. "Want some popcorn?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "Sure," I replied, grateful for the small distraction. But as he got up to prepare it, I noticed the way his eyes lingered on me before he left the room. It wasn't the usual glance of a parent checking in. It felt different, though I couldn't quite place why. When he returned with the bowl, he sat closer than he usually did, our knees almost brushing. At first, I thought nothing of it, but as the night went on, I became increasingly aware of his presence. Every time he shifted, the couch creaked slightly, and every glance in my direction felt heavier than the last. We talked about mundane things, the movie, Mom's trip, but then the conversation shifted. He started asking questions he usually didn't. How I felt about school, whether I was happy, if I ever felt lonely. His voice was calm, but the way he leaned in, watching me intently, made my heart race. "Are you okay, Dad?" I asked, attempting to deflect the attention back to him. He hesitated, then sighed, setting the bowl down on the coffee table. I don't know," he said. "Sometimes I feel like we don't talk enough. Like I don't really know what's going on in your life." His words caught me off guard. We had always been close, but our conversations rarely ventured into emotional territory. I shrugged, trying to keep things light. "There's not much to know. Same old stuff." But he didn't let it drop. "I don't want you to feel like you can't talk to me," he said, his tone softer now. "You're important to me. More than you realize." I forced a smile, trying to push away the unease building in my chest. "Thanks, Dad. I know." The tension in the room was palpable, and when his hand briefly touched mine as he reached for the remote, I flinched slightly. It wasn't intentional, or at least I told myself it wasn't. But the touch lingered in my mind long after he pulled away. "I think I'm going to head to bed," I said abruptly, standing up. My voice wavered slightly, betraying the nerves I was trying to hide. He nodded, his eyes following me as I left the room. "Good night," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent I couldn't quite place. As I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, the shadows on the walls too long. I replayed the night in my mind, analyzing every glance, every word, every touch. Was I imagining things? Was it just the absence of Mom that made everything feel so strange? A soft knock on my door jolted me from my thoughts. My heart raced as I hesitated, unsure whether to answer. "Yeah," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open slightly, and Dad's silhouette appeared in the dim hallway light. "Just wanted to check on you," he said, stepping inside with a glass of water in hand. "I'm fine," I replied quickly, pulling the blankets up around me. "Just tired." He placed the glass on my nightstand, his presence overwhelming in the small room. "If you need anything," he said, his voice low, "I'm here." "Thanks," I murmured, wishing he would leave. The air between us felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension I didn't know how to handle. When he finally left, the door closing softly behind him, I let out a shaky breath. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing. Was I overthinking? Or was there something happening between us, something unspoken, dangerous, and impossible to ignore? The next morning, I woke up with a lingering unease from the night before. The sunlight streaming through my window did little to dispel the tension that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was all in my head, but the memory of Dad standing in my room, his eyes too intense, was hard to forget. When I walked into the kitchen, Dad was already there, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in hand. He greeted me with a casual smile, but I couldn't help noticing the way his gaze lingered as I poured myself a cup of tea. "Morning," he said, his tone light. "Morning," I replied, keeping my focus on my cup. The silence stretched as we went through the motions of breakfast, but the unspoken tension from the previous night lingered. I could feel his eyes on me now and then, though I avoided meeting his gaze. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the air between us felt different, charged in a way I couldn't explain. "I was thinking," Dad said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Maybe we could spend some time together today. Just the two of us." His tone was casual, but the suggestion carried a weight that felt heavier than it should have. "Sure," I said hesitantly. "What do you have in mind?" "Maybe a drive to the lake," he said. "We haven't been there in a while." The lake had always been a special place for us, a spot filled with childhood memories of skipping rocks and sharing ice cream by the water. But now the idea of being alone with him, far from the house and any distractions, made me uneasy. Still, I didn't want to make things more awkward by refusing. "That sounds nice," I said finally, forcing a smile. The drive to the lake was mostly quiet, with only occasional comments about the weather or the scenery breaking the silence. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, trying to steady the nerves fluttering in my stomach. Dad, on the other hand, seemed relaxed, though his occasional glances in my direction didn't go unnoticed. When we arrived, the sight of the water shimmering in the sunlight brought back memories of simpler times. We walked to the shore, the sound of the waves against the rocks filling the silence between us. I tried to focus on the scenery, hoping it would calm the storm of emotions inside me. "It's peaceful here, isn't it?" Dad said, his eyes on the water. "Yeah," I replied, though I felt anything but calm. We sat on the rocks, close enough for our shoulders to touch. The contact made my skin prickle, and I shifted slightly to create space, but Dad didn't seem to notice. He was lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the lake. "I miss this," he said softly. "Spending time with you. Just us." His words caught me off guard, carrying a sadness and longing that felt deeper than simple nostalgia. "I miss it too," I said eventually, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Everything felt so complicated now, so loaded with emotions I didn't want to confront. Dad turned to me, his eyes meeting mine with the same searching look he'd had the night before. "I feel like we've grown apart," he said quietly. "And I don't want that. I don't want to lose you." My heart raced at his words, which felt too intimate, too heavy. I knew this conversation was venturing into territory that made me uncomfortable, but I didn't know how to stop it. "We're fine," I said softly, trying to ease the tension and pull us back from this precarious moment. "We're just busy, you know. Life happens." He nodded, but the intensity in his eyes didn't waver. "I know," he said, "but it feels like more than that. Like you've been slipping away from me." I didn't know how to respond because deep down I suspected he was right. Something had changed between us, though I couldn't pinpoint when or how. Sitting there by the lake felt like a turning point, but not in a way I wanted. Dad reached out and took my hand, his grip firm yet gentle. It was a small gesture, one that should have felt comforting, but instead, it sent a chill down my spine. "You mean so much to me," he said softly, his voice barely audible. More than you realize. I pulled my hand away, desperate to hold on to a sense of normalcy, though nothing about the moment felt normal. My heart raced, and I could feel the intensity of his gaze on me, expectant, as if he were waiting for something I couldn't give. I think we should head back, I said abruptly, standing up. I couldn't stay there any longer, couldn't let the moment linger. The air between us was too thick, charged with an unnamed tension neither of us dared to acknowledge. Dad rose to his feet as well, his face unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might say something that would bring us even closer to the edge. But instead, he simply nodded. Yeah, okay. The drive back was silent, the tension between us more palpable than ever. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, trying to steady my hands, which trembled slightly in my lap. Dad didn't speak either, though I could feel his gaze flick toward me occasionally. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I wasted no time getting out of the car. I rushed inside, needing space, air, and distance. My heart pounded as I made my way to my room and closed the door firmly behind me. For a long time, I just stood there trying to gather my thoughts, to make sense of what had happened. It felt like we'd been skirting the edge of something dangerous all day, and I had no idea what it meant, or where we were headed next. That night, the house felt heavier than ever, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. I tried to distract myself by scrolling through my phone and watching videos, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the day at the lake. The memory of Dad's words, the way he looked at me, the unspoken tension, it all refused to fade. I climbed into bed, pulling the blankets around me in a futile attempt to find comfort. Sleep evaded me, my mind replaying every moment of the day, trying to decipher what it all meant. Was I overthinking? Or was something truly shifting between us? Something I didn't want to acknowledge? A soft knock at my door shattered the fragile calm I'd been clinging to. My heart raced as I hesitated, unsure whether to respond. Yeah, I finally said, my voice trembling. The door opened slightly, and Dad's silhouette appeared in the dim hallway light. He stepped inside, carrying a mug of tea. I thought this might help you sleep, he said, his tone calm but carrying that same undercurrent I couldn't quite place. Thanks, I murmured, sitting up slightly as he placed the mug on my nightstand. For a moment, he just stood there, his presence filling the room in a way that felt almost overwhelming. You seemed quiet today, he said softly. Is everything okay? I'm fine, I replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. Just tired. He sat on the edge of my bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. You know, he began, his voice low, I worry about you sometimes. I know things haven't always been easy for you. His words caught me off guard, and I forced a small smile. I'm okay, really, I said, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But he didn't let it go. I just want you to know how much you mean to me, he said, his eyes fixed on mine. You're so important, more than you realize. There was a raw vulnerability in his tone that made my chest tighten. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But instead, he reached out, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. The touch wasn't forceful, but it felt too personal, too weighted for the moment. You can always talk to me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. About anything. I know, I replied, my voice shaking slightly. Thanks, Dad. His hand lingered for a moment before he finally stood up. Get some rest, he said quietly, pausing by the door. His gaze lingered on me for a second too long before he left, closing the door behind him. I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as I tried to process what had just happened. Was it just me? Was I reading too much into things? Or was there something unspoken, something dangerous simmering beneath the surface? The next morning, I woke with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The house was eerily quiet, and I avoided going downstairs for as long as I could. But eventually, hunger forced me to leave the safety of my room. Dad was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in hand. He greeted me with a casual smile, as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. Morning, he said, his tone light. Morning, I replied, keeping my focus on the toaster as I prepared breakfast. I could feel his eyes on me, and it took everything in me to act normal. As we ate, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Every glance, every word felt charged with an unspoken weight. I tried to make small talk, but it felt forced, and Dad's responses were short and distracted. I was thinking, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Maybe we could watch a movie together tonight. Like we used to. The suggestion caught me off guard, and I hesitated, unsure how to respond. The idea of sitting next to him in the dim light of the living room, the same space where the tension between us seemed to thrive, made my stomach twist. But I didn't want to make things more awkward by refusing. "Sure," I said finally, forcing a smile. "That sounds nice." That evening, as we sat on the couch, the air between us felt heavier than ever. The movie played in the background, but I could barely focus on it. Dad's presence beside me was overwhelming. Every small movement amplified in my mind. At one point, his hand brushed against mine as he reached for the remote. It was a brief, accidental touch, but it sent a jolt through me. I glanced at him, and our eyes met for a moment too long. My heart raced, and I quickly looked away, pretending to adjust the blanket draped over my lap. "I've missed this," Dad said softly, breaking the silence. "Spending time with you." His words sent a chill down my spine, and I forced a small smile, unsure how to respond. "Yeah," I said vaguely, hoping the conversation would end there. But it didn't. He shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. "You're special, you know that," he said, his voice low. "I don't think I tell you that enough." "Thanks," I murmured, pulling the blanket tighter around me as if it could create some kind of barrier between us. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I found myself struggling to breathe. I wanted to get up, to end the moment, but my body felt frozen, trapped under the weight of his gaze. I want you to know how much you mean to me," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "You're so important, and I don't want to lose you." My mind raced, desperate to find a way to defuse the situation. "I should probably get to bed," I said abruptly, standing up. My voice was shaky, but I didn't care. I needed to escape. Dad looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he said, his tone calm but carrying that same unsettling undercurrent. "Good night." "Good night," I replied quickly, retreating to my room. As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. The weight of what had just happened was impossible to ignore. I didn't know what to do, what to think, or how to move forward. All I knew was that something had changed between us, something I wasn't sure could ever be undone. The days following that evening were some of the most emotionally taxing I had ever experienced. Every interaction with Dad felt weighed down by an invisible tension, a heaviness that neither of us could name, but both of us felt. I avoided being alone with him as much as possible, retreating to my room or busying myself with anything that would keep me out of his orbit. Yet, no matter what I did, the memories of that night replayed in my mind on an endless loop. Dad seemed to sense the distance I was putting between us. He was quieter than usual, his words careful and deliberate whenever we spoke. It was as though he was walking on eggshells, unsure of how to bridge the growing gap between us, or if he even should. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table picking at my breakfast, Dad entered the room and paused. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with something I couldn't identify. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. "About what?" I replied cautiously. He sighed, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. "I feel like something's been off between us," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I don't want things to be awkward." I forced a small smile, though my hands fidgeted nervously in my lap. "It's fine," I said quickly. "I've just been busy." "You've been avoiding me," he countered gently, leaning forward slightly. "And I don't blame you. If I've made you uncomfortable in any way, I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. "It's okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I need some space." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I understand," he said after a pause. "I just want you to know that I never meant to cross any lines. You're important to me, and I would never want to do anything to make you feel otherwise." His words hung in the air, and though they offered some relief, they didn't fully erase the unease that had settled between us. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and quickly excused myself to retreat to my room. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but the weight of our conversation lingered. I found myself questioning everything: his intentions, my reactions, and whether we could ever return to the easy relationship we once had. The tension had created a rift between us, one that felt insurmountable, no matter how hard either of us tried to repair it. A few days later, Mom returned from her trip. Her presence brought a sense of normalcy back to the house, and I clung to it like a lifeline. With her around, the dynamic between Dad and me shifted back to something resembling the past, though the undercurrent of tension never fully disappeared. I found myself avoiding moments alone with him, sticking close to Mom or finding excuses to be out of the house. One evening, as I sat in my room scrolling through my phone, Mom knocked on my door and stepped inside. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her tone light but concerned. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, my mind racing. I wanted to tell her everything, to unload the weight I'd been carrying, but fear held me back. What would she think? What would she do? The thought of disrupting our family dynamic even further was unbearable. "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. "Well, if you ever need to talk, I'm here," she said before leaving the room. Her words stayed with me long after she left, a reminder of the support I had but couldn't bring myself to lean on. The truth felt too heavy, too complicated to share. I didn't even fully understand it myself. How could I expect her to? In the weeks that followed, I focused on moving forward. I threw myself into school and spent more time with friends, anything to distract myself from the unresolved tension at home. Dad and I maintained a polite distance, our conversations limited to casual pleasantries and practical matters. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep the fragile balance of our household intact. Yet there were moments when the weight of it all would hit me out of nowhere, when I'd catch him looking at me across the dinner table, or when I'd hear his voice and remember the way he'd spoken to me that night. Those moments were a reminder that no matter how much I tried to bury the past, it was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, Dad joined me, sitting down in the chair beside mine. For a while, we sat in silence, the sound of the wind rustling the trees filling the space between us. "I just want you to be happy," he said finally, his voice soft. "Whatever that takes." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "I know," I said quietly. The words hung in the air, heavy with everything left unsaid. And though I didn't know what the future held for us, I knew one thing for certain. Our relationship had been changed forever, and there was no going back. In the months that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm, though the echoes of what had happened between Dad and me lingered in the background. With Mom back home, the house felt less heavy, and the routines we'd always relied on started to feel somewhat normal again. But the cracks in our relationship were still there, faint but undeniable. Dad kept his distance, respecting the boundaries I'd carefully put in place. Our conversations became shorter and more superficial, as if both of us were afraid that diving any deeper might stir up feelings we weren't ready to confront. I missed the simplicity of how things used to be, but I knew that pretending nothing had happened wasn't the answer. One evening, as I sat alone in my room, I thought about everything that had transpired. The tension, the confusion, and the subtle but impactful shifts in my relationship with Dad. It all weighed heavily on me. I realized I couldn't carry the burden alone any longer. If I wanted to heal, I had to confront my feelings head-on. The next morning, I asked Dad if we could talk. He looked surprised but nodded, leading me to the living room where we sat across from each other. For a moment, the silence between us was overwhelming, but I forced myself to speak. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," I said, my voice trembling. "And I think we need to be honest with each other about how we're feeling and what we're going to do moving forward." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You're right," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to approach this without making things worse. I think the only way to move forward is to acknowledge what's happened," I said. "We can't ignore it, but we also can't let it define our relationship. I don't want to lose the bond we've always had." His shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of the warmth that used to define our connection. "I don't want to lose that either," he said. "You mean so much to me, and I never want you to feel uncomfortable or unsafe around me." His words brought a wave of relief, and though there was still so much left to unpack, I felt a small sense of hope. We talked for a while longer, setting clear boundaries and agreeing to work on rebuilding our relationship, this time with a foundation of open communication and mutual respect. In the weeks that followed, things slowly began to improve. The tension in the house started to dissipate, replaced by a cautious but genuine effort to restore what had been lost. Dad and I found new ways to connect, focusing on the positive aspects of our relationship and leaving the past behind us where it belonged. Looking back, I realized that the experience, as painful and confusing as it was, had taught me valuable lessons. I learned the importance of setting boundaries, of speaking up when something feels wrong, and of not carrying burdens alone. I also learned that relationships, whether familial or otherwise, are complicated and fragile, but they can also be resilient when both parties are willing to work toward understanding and healing. Life is rarely as straightforward as we want it to be. It's messy, full of mistakes and missteps, but it's also full of opportunities to grow and rebuild. I'll never forget the events that changed my relationship with Dad, but I've come to understand that they don't have to define us. They're a part of our story, but they're not the whole story. As I move forward, I carry these lessons with me, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always a path toward light, as long as we're willing to take the steps to find it. What would you do in a situation like this? Could you rebuild trust after something so difficult? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you'd handle it. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that dive deep into the complexities of life and relationships. Stay tuned for our next story. You won't believe the twists it has in store.